So I want to talk about hand bosses, which seems to be a fairly well-known trope in video games, where a boss, usually of giant proportions compared to the protagonist, has separate hands floating, disconnected from its body. And I just wanted to sort of look at a collection of a lot of these bosses and see what they had in common. Because it seems to be a very strange and recurring type of boss. Now, the first thing that this reminds me of is a cortical homunculus, because the cortical homunculi are known for having these gigantic hands, which are gigantic precisely because the homunculi is a representation of the brain. So body parts of the homunculi are developed in proportion to the surface area of the cortical region, which is dedicated to the control of their specific functions. So the hands, since a lot of sensory nerves from the hands terminate in large areas of the brain, the hands therefore are correspondingly large in the homunculi. So what's interesting is that then this kind of suggests that our image of ourselves as a sensation is closer to the image of the homunculi, in the sense that we probably feel our hands and our head more than the rest of the body. So that if we were to imagine ourselves, or in a dreamlike state were to imagine ourselves, it would be as this tinier person with very important hands and very important big head. This, funnily enough, is sort of what happens to us in dreams. I mean, it's common how in the lucid dreaming community, a common trick for achieving lucidity is to look at your hands. That's a common sort of reality check, where looking at your hands in dreams will very often cause a sense of uncanniness. You will notice your hands are weirder, and this will trigger the lucidity. I think this sort of already shows that the hands as something that we can look at. We can't really look that easily at other parts of our body. Our hands are the only thing that you can literally lift to the height of your eyes. They're the only thing that's slightly disembodied from yourself. And in looking at them, at feeling them, because they are so present in the brain, they are more strongly felt. So they would trigger the nervous system and sort of trigger lucidity in a sense. So anyway, the thing that's interesting is that it also sort of appears in fairy tales and in dream imagery and in myth, how little creatures that represent humanity, such as fairies and gnomes, often have these kind of traits, the same traits as the homunculi. The homunculi seems to... it's as if these creatures of folklore and myth are made unconsciously in a sort of as an adaptation of our own cortical representation of ourselves. So that's where these bosses kind of come into play, in my opinion, because the fact they share several things in common. First of all, the hands are separate from the body, but at the same time, the hands are somehow connected to the head. There's a direct connection between the hands and the head, or therefore the hands and the brain. In many of these cases, such in IROC and Godan, the hands literally have eyes in them. So the eye, something that's in the head, gets connected back into the hand. Also pointing to this lucid dreaming thing where you look at your hands and this triggers lucidity. It's as if the eyes and the hands, or the visual field and the hands, is somehow deeply connected in our brains. And secondly, in bosses such as the sort of this Luigi robot or Bongo Bongo, the head, and it is an important feature. So these bosses have two sort of big things, which is that the hands are big, but the head is big as well. And the head is usually a central piece. It's also floating in a sense. I mean, in Bongo Bongo, there's also the spinal cord is really emphasized as well, and ends in this sort of opening weak spot, this opening flower, as if again pointing very directly towards what's at the very top of the spinal cord, which would be the brain. But of course, it's hard to ignore the fact that it's a very sort of phallic boss in a weird way. So sort of connecting the brain to the penis, or in other words, the nervous system as a whole, right? The most intensely sensitive nervous zones connected to the hands. Now, this whole theme of the hands having eyes in them is also a classic sort of religious symbol in many different religions, in the image of the Hamsa, or probably goes by different names, of course, in different cultures, but it's just this classic image of a hand with an eye in it. And I think it kind of has to do with this. In Egyptian mythology, I think it's connected to Horus, the eye. So another thing about the Hamsa is that its very name, Hamsa, refers to the number 5, and it is therefore a kind of pentagram, right? It's signaling the number 5 from the 5 fingers of the hand, but it's abstracting that and turning the 5 fingers into a symbol of the number 5. So in a sense, what we have here are pentagrams with an eye inside of them. So a very sort of classic magic symbol in another sense. You could then abstract that the Hamsa is a much more common symbol than we think if you include pentagrams within the same category. That the Hamsa is a pentagram, but of course then you can abstract it back and consider that the pentagram is somehow related to the human hand, that the number 5 is important for us because of the hand, or in this sort of dual connection between hand and eye, between hand and brain, refer it back to the homunculi and think that this symbol is important because of our sensory self, therefore our senses, right? So that our brain, or our perception of the world and the ways we have divided it into 5 senses becomes a symbol for the sensory perception of the world in itself. So another curious thing about these bosses is how often their bodies are not entirely fleshy. they're not completely human, in the sense that, for example, they're either made of wood or of metal or of rock, or in the case of Bongo Bongo, it looks almost like a corpse, like a dead body. And interestingly enough as well, we have Rudy the Clown and Andros, which, in being a clown and a monkey, sort of connect back to what I've been analyzing in Wario games about the image of the clown, the pig, the monkey, and how they seem to end up representing like a Pinocchio kind of thing, that the hero is evolving or transcending in a like a Buddhist sense, is transcending samsara, and samsara is dominated by the pig. And I think that that sort of represents as well, like, I mean, a primal part of the brain, you could say, right? Obviously the monkey is our past, but the clown, the pig, the rock, right? In that sense, all these other ways of representing this, wood, metal, rock, is a very hermetic kind of symbol, that which is the Pinocchio symbol, that it represents the body in purely material terms, in terms of a certain rough matter which needs to be transformed into a matter which has the breath of life in it. So I think this whole homunculus thing and how it connects to our sensory perception somehow has to do with this exaggerated, these bosses represented like an exaggerated version of the human body, perceived as a material object, which it is, of course, but I think the Hermetic myth has more to do with using these things as symbols of transformation, that first you are not your true self, you're Pinocchio, and then you turn into a real person, then you become your true self. First you're a piece of rock, piece of wood, and then you transform. And how this transformation has something to do, as in Hermeticism as well, and with precisely a very physical thing, about with the spinal cord, with meditation, with yoga, with the body itself undergoing a certain process that reaches the brain. And this could also have to do with why all this symbolism, as I was exploring in my previous video, centers around the head a lot of the times, and the head as the final receiver of a certain explosion of energy, right? As in, and the energy rising up the column reaches the head, and that seems to be the place, again connected with the eyes and with the visual field, where a certain transformation of your entire perception of yourself in the world takes place. Anyway, thanks for listening.